morning to our virtual audience. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all then on behalf of Advocates for International Development, the East Africa Law Society, and the Rwanda Bar Association. The focus of this webinar is on responsible business practice and has been developed for the legal community. I am Yasmin Batliwala, the Chief Executive of Advocates for International Development, or A4ID as we're also known. We are a small non-profit, but we leverage the power of 50,000 lawyers worldwide who donate their time and their skills to work with our development partners, who include over 800 NGOs, social enterprises, development country governments, and organizations such as the UN, the World Bank, to use the law more effectively. So far, our work has impacted in over 130 countries. We believe the law can and should be used more effectively to eradicate global poverty. Our work is framed around the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, continuing our focus on the role of the law and how lawyers can play their part. We published the very first guide, in fact, on the UN Guiding Principles specifically for the legal profession in 2013. Since then, an increasing number of businesses have translated the UN Guiding Principles into their practices and into their policies. However, many still have yet to do so. They will not need only to have advice on emerging regulatory requirements and involving national laws, which reflect human rights principles, but also guidance on how to incorporate human rights concerns into their practices in order to maintain the ability to provide authoritative and comprehensive advice to businesses. As a result, firms that do not adopt the principle of respect for human rights could potentially risk failing to attract new clients. In addition, just as with other aspects of corporate responsibility, law firms that are able to demonstrate their respect for human rights may find that they have the competitive edge when it comes to recruitment, and indeed they might find it easier to keep and motivate their employees, as well, of course, retaining their clients. Now, over the course of the next 2 hours, we're going to hear about the relevance of the UN Guiding Principles in respect to being a responsible business. But we also want to hear from you, so there will be an opportunity to discuss your thoughts as we want to make this session as interactive as possible. For now, your microphones will be switched off. And if they are not, can I then request you to switch them off now? We're also going to record this part of the session. Now, I'm delighted to say that we have an exceptional panel of contributors who all come to business and human rights from very different backgrounds and indeed very different parts of the world. Our first speaker is Hanningtone Amol, who's the Chief Executive of the East Africa Law Society, and he will be making the opening remarks on behalf of EALS. Hanningtone.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Colleagues from the Republic of Rwanda, Rwanda Bar Association, and from the in-house and even government practice in Rwanda, welcome once again to this session. If I recall, this is the second time in as many months that we are meeting discussing the subjects of business and human rights. And I'm also pleased to see Roger Leese and Anna Kirkpatrick again. Once again, they've been walking this journey with us in the past, and they've put their stamp in building capacity in BHR in this region. May I also say, I'm pleased with the cooperation that we've received from the Rwanda Bar Association and the leadership of the law community in Rwanda. Antonny Julien Kavaruganda, who also happens to be my boss at the East Africa Law Society, together with the team at the Secretariat led by Victor. We really appreciate the support you've given our team towards ensuring success once again of this session. At East Africa Law Society, we are pleased with the partnership with A4ID Yasmin and the team, Patrick leading the East African office, and for always leading the thought processes on how best we can protect both our businesses and the citizens, that's the stakeholders in the business, including the workers and the communities they work in, from harsh consequences of non-observance of best practices of the UN guiding principles. If I could recall, when we were in Rwanda last, we faced some challenges or questions where we were being asked outrightly, what has human rights got to do with commerce? What has it got to do with businesses? And I remember Mr. Richard Mugisha educating us that the best way that UN guiding principles will be understood, for instance, in the context of Rwanda, could be to coin it as a responsible business, which truly it is what it is. When we speak about business and human rights principles, we are really not talking about the hardcore human rights, but we are talking about how responsible businesses can be and responsive to the circumstances of the surrounding within which they operate. And that's exactly what you'll be hearing today. So whenever you hear mention of responsible business or business and human rights principles or UN guiding principles, then you know that we are speaking about one and the same thing. Now, why would East Africa Law Society create or focus a program on business and human rights principles or on responsible business? This is on the realization that the integration of the East African community will not be successful until and unless economic integration is fully achieved. That is meaningful cross-border trade and meaningful extraction and utilization of our natural resources as a region. That would include tourism, that's basically mining tourism resources for the benefit of the people, oil and gas, minerals, water resources, what you call the blue economy, the oceans and the lakes, and timber. East Africa is rich in natural timber, and even, indigenous agriculture. All these will or are essentially economic activities, and they are some of the drivers of the economic integration. Sadly, the main stakeholders or the communities where the resources are sited are the least beneficiaries of this. And even where they could benefit, they are subjected to what you could call atrocities. In the neighboring country to Rwanda, that's DRC, you know what goes about there, about child labor, forced labor in the mines, about the fact that ores and diamonds are mined, but the communities don't know anything about this. The mining is
Unfortunately, it seems that Hanningtone has a connection issue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Hanningtone, I think we lost you. I certainly can't hear you. And from my screen, you seem to have frozen. So can I then thank Hanningtone for what you've had to say. Thanks very much indeed. Let's then move on to our next speaker, who is Julien Gustave Kavaruganda. Julien is the president of the Rwanda Bar Association, and he will be making the opening remarks on their behalf. So, Julien Gustave, can I invite you to speak, please?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Yasmin. It's a pleasure for me, and I begin by thanking Yasmin as CEO of Advocate for International Development. It's a very big pleasure for the Rwanda Bar Association to work with you together with the East African Law Society. It's an opportunity given to our members to be able to have this opportunity to discuss among themselves, to see the experts from different regions in the world, and among ourselves, two people from Rwanda, Counsel Herbert Rubasha and Antonny, and our fellow friends from Clifford Chance. So I'm just thankful to have this opportunity for our members to discuss the ethical business, the environment protection, what we should be advising our clients in a way of making sure that they are doing business in a way that is not stopping them to make money when respecting human rights, when not being involved in corruption, money laundering, such things that are affecting negatively the stakeholders, the employees, and the clients. So we want clients to be business responsible, and I think it's the topic of this session and the discussion that will be happening today. And again, I'm just thankful to be having this training, capacity building of our members, opportunity with breakout session that will be happening for ensuring that there is a respect in doing business, corporate responsibility, when our clients, when our being external lawyers or in-house lawyers are discussing matter of business, they also have to take in consideration everything that can negatively impact their community, the environment, and the situation where they are acting in. So I have only 5 minutes to say thank you, especially to Yasmina and Hanningtone for organizing this, and thanks for the panelists for taking the time to interact with us and share with us your experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Julien. And now then on to our main speakers. And I'm really delighted to welcome Roger Leese, who's the partner at Clifford Chance, as well as his colleague, Anna Kirkpatrick, who is the senior associate at Clifford Chance. Now, Roger will be providing a very great overview of the international legal framework for responsible business, and Anna will also be addressing corporate responsibility, and will do so by looking at the role of the lawyer in ensuring a corporate response in respect to mitigation of legal risk, and importantly, reputational risk. So over to you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining today. I'm sorry that we're doing this virtually. Anna and I have visited Rwanda and Kigali a couple of times and met with, I think, a number of you are on this call to talk about some of these issues, and we're sad to be missing out on that opportunity today. But anyway, it's great that we can use technology to get together. Excuse me. If you could go to that first slide there, which is ESG. I think some of the slides are just clicked on, unfortunately. Could you go back to the second? No? Could you go back to the beginning of these slides?
Yes, I'm trying to. Just give me a second. Sorry.
I'll start anyway. That's it. You've got it. That's it. Thank you very much. So actually, we've heard a few phrases used today already. We've heard about responsible business and business and human rights and sustainability. And these phrases can be very confusing because there are so many of them. But what we're finding at the moment is that people are beginning to coalesce around a particular phrase to cover all of these issues and challenges, and that is ESG. And that stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. And it's a very broad concept, and it really means the three interlinked concepts used to describe the ethical behavior and impact of companies. And essentially, as you can see, the E is for environmental, S for social, and G for governance. And this, as I said, it's extremely broad. So within E, you've got, if you like, more old-fashioned issues that businesses can face in terms of pollution of the environment, mining, and so on and so forth. But you've got now, as a key issue there, of course, climate change. Within the social issue, you've got employment and employment regulation and so forth, but you've also increasingly got issues around supply chains and modern slavery. And then finally, governance. Now, essentially by governance, what's meant here is how are businesses regulated, how do they regulate themselves, how are they set up so as to ensure they have the necessary governance in place to identify and address the risks that we've been describing, the environmental and social risks. Many of these are now being drawn together in business thinking and being looked at as a whole. And that's also happening within formal legislation and regulation as well, as we'll see. And one example I can give from just a few days ago is I heard from a colleague of mine who works in our office in Australia, that one of her mining clients, and I heard mining being mentioned before as something very relevant to the East African Law Society. A mining client was saying that in relation to their seeking borrowing from a bank, the bank was now saying, please show us your ESG policies. And the client was saying to us, what does that mean? You know, what's incorporated there? But you can just see how that thinking is beginning to come into the way businesses are approaching things and what our clients need us to understand as well. So can I now go on to the next slide? Thank you very much. So this next slide is really just to sort of, if you like, address the question, why is this happening? And I'm not going to say very much about this, but essentially you've got a number of factors here. You've got the value destroying reputational risk from something going wrong in this area, for a big scandal from one of our clients for the business. But then you've also got increasing regulatory and legal requirements, some of which we'll talk about. And then you've also got simply, if you like, but the relevance and the activity of stakeholders, whether it's shareholders, whether it's customers, whether it's the wider community. And then there's also a positive sense, and we heard about that earlier as well, where businesses are actually looking to get a competitive edge by differentiating themselves from others and demonstrating that, you know, why should you buy from me? Well, because my products are responsible or produced responsibly, and that's a competitive edge that our clients can get. So now I'll move on to the next slide, and if you like, the core of this, which is about international frameworks. And essentially at the moment there are quite a lot of international frameworks governing ESG related issues, but most of these are actually non-binding at the moment. We are talking about the UN guiding principles, which we'll talk about more later, and which have already been mentioned, which deal specifically with business and human rights. Then we've got more general standards, such as the principles of responsible investment and principles of responsible banking, both of which are sponsored by the UN. You've got the Equator principles, which particularly relate to lending and to projects. And then on climate change, of course, you have the Paris Agreement. Those are all, if you like, at the international level, and as I said, are not directly binding upon our clients, upon us as businesses as well, and upon our client businesses. However, those international standards are influencing national and regional law. And actually, you can only really have an understanding of what's happening at that local level by understanding that international framework. And I'm going to give a couple of examples here. So the first we've got as an example here is drawn from the EU. And here it's about the transnational systemization at the EU level in relation to sustainable finance. And that started, as this slide says, in January 2018 with a high-level plan on sustainable finance. And essentially it's looking very much at and focusing on reporting and disclosure in relation to sustainable financial products. A key concern here is to ensure that customers aren't missold financial products as green when in fact they're not. And this is now often referred to as preventing greenwashing, another version of whitewashing. So greenwashing, some of you may have heard of that phrase before. And essentially, we're about to see the coming into force of the disclosure regulation, which will be, if you like, legally binding and will mean a much greater disclosure around sustainability issues. And one thing I wanted to mention here is, although the thrust of all of this is about green issues, about climate change in particular and the environment, within the regulations, there's also a requirement to disclose all other issues that go to sustainability, and in particular human rights issues. So in other words, you're not going to be allowed to call an investment in a wind farm sustainable if in fact building it has involved human rights abuse, such as the removal of local people from the land without free prior informed consent, for instance. So that's an example of how it's coming through in terms of regulation on the environmental and connected ways. But if we go into the next slide here, this is a snapshot, and I'm not going to go through all this at all. This is a snapshot of developing legislation and regulation around the world within the sphere of social and human rights issues. So once again, what you see here is that there are, of course, international treaties on human rights, particularly at the UN level. Those don't directly bind businesses, but there is, though, this body of national and transnational laws which are incorporating aspects of that international framework, such as, and in particular, the UN guiding principles. But at the moment, as you can see, and this is just giving you the picture, a very brief picture, it's a real patchwork of laws, which of course for us lawyers can be quite good in terms of our clients needing help just to understand this. But as I said, what's important is many of the concepts now embodied in these laws are actually drawn from some of those international principles. But Anna will pick up on this further. If you go on to the next slide now. Now I'm coming on to the governance side of things. And actually within the governance sphere, company law, broadly in my experience, has similar elements to it across jurisdictions, where essentially most businesses are going to be run through a corporation. That corporation will usually have a board of directors, and that board will have duties to the company to promote the success of the company. Here I'm just giving the example of the one I know best, which is the UK law, and this concept is embodied within our Companies Act of 2006, and it's known as the duty to promote the success of the company. But I'd be interested to hear, but I would expect you have something similar to this concept in Rwanda, and certainly, as I said, it's a very widespread concept. But what was interesting in 2006, now 14 years ago, of course, in the UK, is that within that duty, there was a specific direction that directors should also have regard to a series of non-financial factors in the making of their decision, and that's highlighted in this bar here. And although I'm not picking up on the precise wording, in fact, those factors are what we now know as ESG factors: the environment, people, the community, the supply chain, etc. Now, I remember in 2006 giving some talks to clients about how this might affect, how they do business. In reality, not a lot happened, but it's funny that that was embedded in 2006. It's now very much come to life as ESG has come up the agenda. And actually, there's now been additional legislation in the UK, which is now requiring businesses to disclose formally and publicly on how they have taken these non-financial factors into account in their decision making. And this is known as the Section 172 statement, and basically is now in force, and we're starting to see those statements made. So that's, if you like, a journey we've seen on the governance side of this within the UK. I now want to just touch upon the sustainability issue, which of course is getting so much attention at the moment, which is climate change. Would you like to just go on to the next slide? And essentially, I'm going to just deal with two, if you like, aspects which I think are of particular relevance to us as lawyers within the field of climate change. Now, of course, the international framework in relation to climate change is the Paris Agreement, but then legislation and regulation is being developed at the national level. And essentially, as I said, there are two sides I just wanted to mention briefly. Firstly, this is leading to a lot of litigation. There are now getting close to 2,000 cases that have been mapped around the world in relation to climate change. And essentially, these cases surround issues such as loans by banks being made to mining companies and other heavy emitters, and whether those banks are in danger because of the risks that they're exposed to if that goes wrong, and whether they're disclosing those risks properly to shareholders. That's just one source of litigation in this area. And that's an area where, of course, we as clients can help. Could you just go back one slide? We've just missed out the climate change slide. More positively, it's the next slide to that. Thank you very much. More positively, what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of our clients and businesses looking at how they are going to deal with their carbon footprint and emissions. And a lot of them are adopting policies mirroring the Paris Agreement in terms of looking at net zero. And essentially, what I'm saying here is this is a slide which we're using with clients to sort of explain this area and what's happening and the different types of approach to this. This can apply worldwide because these principles have been, if you like, developed at that international level. But then within any particular jurisdiction, there are laws and regulations often being adopted to put this into practice. And that's particularly where we're coming in as legal practitioners to help our clients think through how they may go about incorporating these principles within their business across their business, and in particular in particular jurisdictions. And does that require particular reporting? Does it require particular consents from government or others? And that's as I said, where we come in. And just by way of example here, just thinking about Rwanda, I'm sure many of you know that Rwanda is actually the first African country to have recently submitted tougher targets to the UN, and with a promised reduction of 16% by 2030 of emissions against business as usual baseline. To achieve that, the government's going to need business to play its part, and those businesses are going to need help from lawyers like you. So with that, I'll hand over to Anna. Anna, you may be on mute.
Thank you very much, Roger. So Roger's already explained the National and Policy Framework around responsible business. To the measures that he's mentioned, I'd just like to also refer to the SDGs, of course, which are a policy framework which Rwanda in particular has committed to. And I think the launch of the SDGs in Africa, efforts to reach those goals by 2030, was launched in Kigali by the president back in 2017. And I'd also just like to say, in terms of responsible business, businesses also has obviously been recognised for a long time as being a powerful actor in society. And the concept that business should be responsible is not in itself particularly new. But what is new about the frameworks that we're seeing at an international and national level is that now the onus is really on business to look to their own operations and also their business relationships to help to improve society. And specifically in respect of the issues that we're discussing today, how businesses can identify both human rights, governance and environmental risks within their business, and also their business relationships to promote a better and more sustainable future for everyone. And in terms of how lawyers play into that, I just wanted to make 2 points, which is firstly that law firms are of course businesses themselves and will be caught by some of this regulation that will be coming down, that is already in play and that will be coming down the line. And they will be expected to comply with that regulation both within their own business and also to the extent that they have supply chains and also with their business route. But it's increasingly the case that the legal profession can play a pivotal role in supporting business and meeting their expectations. And that role that lawyers have in assisting business, I think for a long time has been seen as one as being a trusted advisor. And we are increasingly seeing in our own work providing legal advice to support strategic decisions that are made by businesses. But what is becoming increasingly plain is that in the realm of ESG regulation, then it will really be assisting clients with their implementation of human rights and environmental due diligence regulations, which is really where the trajectory of the regulatory and legislative initiatives are going, that lawyers will be assisting with. And I just wanted to take a few minutes just to look at that concept of human rights due diligence a bit more closely. So the concept of human rights due diligence really derives from the UNGP, which itself derives from the 3-pillar framework. And many of you already be familiar with this, but as you see from the slide, this is the 3 concepts: that states have a duty to protect human rights, corporates have a responsibility to respect human rights, and that there is, as a matter of principle, the right for victims of human rights abuses to access a remedy for human rights impacts. As Roger has already mentioned, this is a non-binding soft law instrument that sets a gold standard as to how businesses and governments should react to the potential infringements of human rights in relation to business or related to business activities. And since it came into play in 2011, we've seen it had a huge impact on the way that states, companies, NGOs and other stakeholders have thought about dealing with business-related human rights abuses. The novel part of the framework is the corporate responsibility to respect, which in a nutshell essentially expects companies to respect all internationally respected human rights, and because it's a soft law instrument, it doesn't have any sanctions, formal sanctions attached to it, but essentially if you don't comply or if you don't meet the expectation, then you will be judged by society and lose your social license. In practice, what the responsibility to respect really means is that businesses should commit to do no harm, but they should also proactively address the human rights impacts with which the business is involved. And if you could just move to the next slide, please. In order to meet the responsibility to respect, companies are expected to implement a human rights policy and embed that within their culture, and then they are expected to carry out human rights due diligence. And just to take a step back and really think about what human rights what due diligence means in this context, this is far wider than we as lawyers might typically understand the concept to be. And it really, in terms of the UNGP, is supposed to refer to an ongoing management process that any reasonable and prudent enterprise would undertake to meet its responsibility to respect human rights. What you have on the slide there is a graphic depiction of all the stages of human rights due diligence. And you can see there that step 1 is embedding policies and governance, as I've already mentioned. And then we have 5 other steps which are cyclical and repeated. There at step 2, we have the identification and assessment of adverse impacts that a business has, both on through its own operations, but also through its supply chains and through its business relationships. And the important thing is here that it expects businesses to look at impacts through its entire value chain, and expects businesses to try and assess how they're actually involved with those impacts. Once the business has taken those steps, then it's expected to either cease, prevent, or mitigate those impacts, or, and you can see there at step 6, provide or cooperate in the remediation of it. Step 4 is that businesses are expected to track the measures that they're taking, and this is really centered on the concept that what is measured is managed. And then last but by no means least, businesses are expected to communicate with stakeholders that are impacted by their businesses and their operations, by their business relationships and operations, and they're supposed to report either within their organizations or, if appropriate, externally on the entire process. So what they found, what steps they've taken, how they've communicated with stakeholders to come to these conclusions, and what they plan to do about these issues in the future. I said before that lawyers have got a role to play in human rights due diligence. I just wanted to take a moment to point out a few of the legal aspects of this human rights due diligence process. And that's even when it's just articulated as it is here in the human rights, in the UNGP, sorry. So for example, right at the outset, if you're a business who wants to carry out human rights due diligence, you'll have the question of when are you supposed to carry out human rights due diligence? Is it at the beginning of every business relationship? Is it when you are renewing your contract with an ongoing supplier? Is it when you are buying a new business? The answer is it may be relevant to carry out human rights due diligence in all of these situations, but you'll probably have to work with your lawyers to identify if it's appropriate, and if so, how to dovetail it into your existing processes that you have and your legal documents that you have in order to carry out that transaction. Another example, if you find that there are adverse or negative human rights impacts in your business, what do you do about it? Can you use your contract? Have you got contractual terms that can help you seek information from your supplier, for example, as to issues that might be prevalent in the supply chain? Can you terminate the contract? Why remedy? Can you and then finally, when you're thinking about tracking processes, when a business is and communicating the findings of your processes, there are obviously important issues about record keeping, confidentiality of information, and how you balance that with the other side of the coin, which is that the responsibility does expect some sort of transparency, does expect some sort of reporting. But when you do that reporting, you will want to make sure that it is accurate and doesn't. As Roger said, this concept of human rights due diligence is being used more and more. And if I just reduce it down to the key components again, assessing, mitigating, tracking, and reporting, what we're seeing crucially is that these principles that were originally seen in the UNGP for human rights impacts are now being seen applied to environmental impacts and governance impacts. And if I could have the next slide, please. I just wanted to illustrate that we've already seen this in some of the international standards, so most notably the OECD guidelines, which set standards for OECD multinational enterprises on issues of bribery and corruption, environment, and more recently human rights, and a series of others impacts as well. The OECD has completely aligned itself with the human rights due diligence approach in the UNGP and incorporated that within the standards. So in essence, the due diligence that is expected of multinationals when they're looking at their environmental impacts, their governance impacts, and their human rights impacts is that they need to do this as a process of identifying, preventing, mitigating, providing remedy and reporting. And that applies across the value chain. And it's very obvious that it's hand in glove with the UNGP. And the other example I will just point to briefly, if I could have the next slide, is the way in which this is now crystallizing into legal obligations, taken up the gauntlet with a UNGP type approach to due diligence. We saw the European Parliament say in times of COVID that they thought that human rights and environmental due diligence was essential for supply chain resilience. To say that human rights and environmental due diligence throughout the value chain, the entire value chain, is important, and will be tabling legislation around this this concept of this framing of due diligence in 2021. The slide basically shows a proposal that's been put forward by the Legal Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, which may be taken into account by the European Commission as they formulate this legislation. And I'll just pick out the salient points here, which is essentially that the type of due diligence that we are seeing here for human rights, but also for environment and also governance risks, has all of the same features as human rights due diligence in the UNGP, i.e. it requires companies to identify their impacts, to report if they have none, but also to publish their risk assessments. It requires them, if they have identified risks, to publish a due diligence strategy, saying what they will be doing with their business partners in their supply chain to address the risks that they've identified. And importantly for lawyers, the proposed text suggests that says that undertakings should use contractual clauses and policies to implement their strategy within their value chain. And lastly, it also expects undertakings to implement a grievance mechanism in line with the UNGP to ensure that there is a mechanism by which victims of impacts, all of these impacts, can raise their grievances with undertakings so that they can be resolved at an early stage. So the last feature that's important about this text is that all of the consequence of failing to carry out the due diligence is liability. We're not quite sure what form that will take, whether it will be purely civil liability or whether it may have criminal liability if, for example, corporations are repeated offenders and fail to carry out due diligence on more than one occasion. That's something that's envisaged by the text, and we'll wait to see. Now, the important thing about this this movement in the EU is that the EU itself considers itself to be setting the first to be setting a global standard in this space, and it is not unreasonable to think that this sort of standard will be reflected in the future. But importantly, whilst this applies only to EU companies and to companies that are operating within the EU, it obviously is going to have an effect on all of those companies that are within the supply chain or value chain of those EU companies, and therefore the impact of it can be very far-reaching. And I think for lawyers in Rwanda, but everywhere, to be aware of these developments as they are coming to the fore, and be able to help their clients with the requirements of HRDD upfront will be a good business opportunity, but also the right thing to do. I'll hand back to Yasmin now.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I say thank you, Anna, and thank you, Roger, for a most informative session. Now, can I ask people, please, again, to just remind you to switch off your mute button, because otherwise, if you don't do that, there's interference and we can't properly hear our speakers talking. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Herbert Rubasha. Herbert is one of the founding partners of MRB Attorneys, and he will be providing the corporate governance perspective and will be looking at the role of in-house counsel in navigating the legal challenges as they apply in Rwanda. So, Herbert. Herbert, are you there? I think Herbert was there with us earlier. I don't know if he is still.
He's connected, but Herbert, you are on mute. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay,
Yeah,
well done.
perfect.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Yasmin, for having me. And just to start with, it's very important to state that when we are talking about, human rights and businesses, it becomes inevitable to actually situate where you find, these human rights. Particularly in our context, we understand and we know that these human rights, most of them are born from either national legislations or international legislations. But again, when we come to business, definitely it is going to be very important to state that with either the specific jurisdictions or businesses that has been brought in by foreign companies all together form this robust, I can say, part of the business, which at the end of the day now puts us in a situation whereby we have also to address some of the consequences that are borne by some of these businesses. And this is where, particularly like in our context in Rwanda, we come in, whereby you'll find that some of the businesses that have been ongoing are actually, either deliberately or undeliberately perpetuating some of these human rights, violations. Next slide. It also becomes important to note that some of these human rights violations, at the end of the day, there's none other than the state that actually plays the intermediary role in trying to address some of the issues that might come here and there. But again, on the top of it all, we all acknowledge that it's actually one of those difficult situations when one tries to divorce human rights and business, because at the end of the day, you'll find that business in one way or the other way represents development, and that development comes with some bit of human rights issues. And at the end of the day, you'll find that the state will need to come in to actually mediate the situation and how to actually have the two run together without necessarily interfering with one another. Now, next slide. Talking again about human rights in Rwanda, it's also very important to understand that these rights are guaranteed in different legislations. Talking about legislations, you can talk about either the national legislations, of course, with the constitution being the supreme law of the country, but also talking about some other national legislation, such as the company law. Of course, we have employment law and some other laws that I have not mentioned, but also we have international laws that Rwanda is a party to. And of course, they include the whole list of laws that, conventions that I have mentioned, which include the ICCPR, IC, ESCR, IRO, CRC, and so many others. Next slide. Now, the most now important thing here that we're going to look at is how do we actually look at human rights in the context of the corporate governance, of course, vis-a-vis human rights. You'll find that talking about corporate governance becomes one of those essential and critical aspects that are indispensable in any democratic market economy. And governance comes in mainly especially to regulate the relationship between the management of the board members, shareholders, and other stakeholders of the business. Now, it is also very crucial to understand that when you talk about the corporate governance here in Rwanda, which is it's also very important to note that when you talk about the corporate governance here in Rwanda, it's provided and elaborated under our Company Act, which actually sort of provides the framework in which the management, the board members, and the shareholders, including the shareholders of the company, have to sort of relate. At the end of the day, this will have an impact on the whole performance or perception of the company, which is basically to either make it sustainable, but also to create and maintain investment. Now, corporate governance here, as provided in our Company Act, you'll find that it relates most especially to next slide. You'll find that corporate governance, as provided in our Company Act, you'll find that it actually, provides a system by which companies operate and function, or if you want, the way how the companies are directed and controlled. And you'll find that in any company, as a matter of fact, any company in Rwanda has to have a board of directors. And this board of directors will be responsible for the governance of that very company. And the shareholders in that company will serve as and auditors, of course, to satisfy themselves that an appropriate governance structure is in place. Now, another responsibility of the shareholders, you'll find that it will include, of course, putting in place, strategic plans, provide leadership to the company, and of course, supervising the management.
Herbert, we seem to have lost you. So what I'll do is say thank you very much indeed then for a comprehensive overview. That's very, very helpful, and we will see you later anyway in one of the sessions. Your session useful. I know from our session we had some very shy retiring lawyers, which is I know unusual. However, we quite late in started to get into quite a interesting discussion. Now, what I'd like to do is give the opportunity for everyone to just start to feedback. So can I perhaps invite the first group who spoke about human rights and environmental due diligence, so Anna's group, to ask the rapporteur from your group to tell us what, or give us a briefing of the discussion that took place, please?
Yes, thank you. We do have a rapporteur from our group. I'm just trying to see whether he's still online. Whether we've lost him. Charles, there you are. Are you able to give us your thoughts on the points that we discussed? And
okay, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, we talked a number of things about human rights and due diligence when it comes to the issue of corporate governance. First and foremost, we realize that in most of occasions where there is it starts with the business, we should go to the human rights controls, which will lead to due diligence. The due diligence always play the important part in any aspect of human right, because in any corporation or in any business, a business always has one goal in mind, which is profit making. So any kind of business, any kind of engagement, they start with the issue of the profit without looking into the impact of that business to the community, which now affect the human and give back now to the human rights violations. So what we have discussed, we realize that it is important for any corporation, state entity, to start with the due diligence, so that to check to what extent will this kind of business affect the environment, because environment comes with a number of issues. Both human and animal rights can be affected through a small kind of business. In the discussion, we had a number of scenarios. We realized that in most occasions, we have the government policies. And the government policy always decide that it's for good of the public. But in actualization, it's not for the good of the public. Maybe they look one aspect, the economy. And when they just check on the part of the economy, they will look it in terms of revenue. So as lawyers, we should stand for the people under public interest litigations. Because when that right has been violated, who will litigate on behalf of the people? Because most of the community, they don't have enough resources to stand up for themselves. So they need somebody to stand for themselves. And the people they need are the lawyers. So lawyers need to play a bigger role when it comes to the human rights and due diligence to avoid such outcomes to the general public. That's what we discuss in summary. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, now can I call on group 2 to discuss the legal frameworks? This is Roger's group. Is there a rapporteur for your group, Roger?
I think we don't actually have one, so I think it will be me, Tara. So hi everybody. So we discussed, as Yasmin's just said, the use of international legal frameworks and how useful they are in Rwanda, you know, if they are actually of any use, proving to be of any use at the moment to lawyers in Rwanda. And Roger started off the discussion by suggesting that, you know, traditionally as lawyers, we have expertise in particular areas and they're divided in a very kind of clear and definitive way. You know, we're either litigators or we work in employment, or we, you know, we're very boxed in. And so the question that we started off and which really led to the bulk of our discussion was, you know, what is the situation in Rwanda, and in terms of the frameworks that do exist, are they kind of implemented as these very overarching, you know, are they implemented in this very overarching way, or is it quite difficult, and are there still these very specific, is it very difficult to integrate them into the specific areas? So I think it was John at Fountain Advocates who initially started off the discussion in relation to this, and discussed, you know, the way that there are particular laws in Rwanda. So for example, Rwanda's employment law, Rwanda's company law, and also laws in relation to money laundering that do have these international elements and do appear to be universally applicable, because they have this kind of inherent, or they need to have this inherent international element. And Roger commented that actually Rwanda seems to have incorporated more international law frameworks into its own laws than a lot of other countries. And then the discussion moved on to the fact that actually, you know, when clients come to law firms, what they're expecting is actually a commercial lawyer who has a broad understanding of many a topic, rather than these very clear, distinct areas, and that they want not just a wide understanding, but also a depth of understanding. So we then sort of discussed the idea that actually that's where it becomes very useful to have these international frameworks in place and in mind, because it's these that businesses seem to have adopted. And when you start, you know, trying to deal with regulations from individual countries, it takes away that common approach. And that's why the international frameworks are useful, because lawyers are then in a much better position to sort of understand what their clients are looking for by following these international standards. So yeah, that was the bulk of the discussion, and we then briefly moved on to a second discussion point about climate change specifically, and the fact that, you know, Rwanda signed up to the Paris Agreement, and whether or not this has been seen to play out in laws and regulations affecting clients in Rwanda, or if there's, you know, a lot of work to be done still. And you know, briefly, this idea of something called a company social license was discussed, where assessments are done on the environmental, or increasingly done on the environmental impact of a project. And although there are no binding regulations necessarily at this moment in time, you know, certain conduct is increasingly expected of companies by key stakeholders in relation to the environment and in relation to climate change.
Thank you very much indeed, Tara. That was really very, very helpful. Thank you. The next group then looked at challenges particularly faced by lawyers and in-house counsel in promoting responsible business practices. That was your group, Anthony.
Thank you, Yasmin. Let me invite our rapporteur, Hussein Chiza.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Mr. Mukulu Anthony, for the wonderful chair of our group. We did indeed have quite an interesting discussion with our group in regards to, you know, what are some of the challenges we've already faced during this period of, more so during COVID-19, but also what are some of the challenges are the in-house lawyers also equally facing as we all look forward to progress. So we highlighted quite a number of them, and we acknowledge that COVID-19 mostly has affected us lawyers and also in-house lawyers. But also we talked more directly on some of those challenges that we thought really did really exist. And we realized that COVID-19 led to some law firms, first of all, to lay off some staff in the area where they had to comply with government guidelines. And I think this was equally globally, where most countries were under lockdown. So it is with law firms had also to be impacted. And this also led to some lawyers and also in-house lawyers being laid off, but in a more amicable way, not in a way that is more maybe negative, and of course not having that kind of discussion with your staff before they are laid off. So it was necessary to have this kind of discussion and amicable settlement, and also realize the situation and make sure that everyone understood the reasons, but also the law firms were working enough to show empathy and compassionate, but also support to these staff members during lockdown. Then the other thing was also we realized that we had to work from home. Many lawyers and in-house lawyers had to adjust. That means from working in their usual spaces of work and switch to working from home. And this also brought in the question of now, were we really prepared to switch to that kind of system? Because we acknowledge that many law firms still lacked the technology setup to facilitate this kind of space, working from these spaces from home. So there are those law firms that had contingency plans that really could be applied in this way, and this made them to perhaps buy in new tools, technology tools to facilitate the adjustments, and also to come in on board to either if you need to slash down on unnecessary expenditures and only focus on expenditures that are really meant to save lives and also support your staff. Those are the law firms that really did well. Then those who didn't comply or didn't have those kind of contingency plans have really impacted their working space, but also their staff generally. Then we also discussed, one of the members mentioned that legal services were not taken as essential services during lockdown in Rwanda. But I came back and said, no, I think that's to the lesser extent, because we realized that lawyers actually were allowed to still operate and also render their services during lockdown because they realized that, let's say, inmates or people who were put in jails, maybe those who are considered as accused and are put in jails, they're still required to have access to justice. And that's the reason why the government of Rwanda allowed lawyers to still render their services, so long as you had to comply with the set guidelines that require you to get the pass, keep the necessary health guidelines. Then our chair or the moderator mentioned something in regards to law firms and also businesses not having environmental policies and social policies, which relates to UN recommendations. And I think this is, as a group, we agreed that as we go forward, we really need to rise up and have these policies in place, because as Rwanda positions itself to be a center for international business and also attracts more international investors, we need to have these policies in place as law firms, because these investors will have to ask these questions. Do you have these policies in place? So that even if you want to do due diligence, you have to relate to your policies that can guide you to find if you really fit in this kind of business. Then we also, one of the colleagues mentioned something to do with lockdown impact, which was the lawyers who are on the intern list. As you may know, in our legal practice, the new lawyers who are enrolling into the association, they have to be put on the intern list. They have to undergo internship for 1 year. So those that were going through internship were impacted in a way that they could not proceed, engaging their law firms and also offering their services because it was lockdown. So they had to, they were saying that they had to scale down in terms of the pace, and also they are now resuming their internship. This affected their perhaps periodical timelines that perhaps they had put in place for them to have graduated and enrolled fully. So generally, these are some of the things that we mentioned, and I think the major ones were policies, that law firms need environmental and social policies, but also we need to be agile and also have contingency plans for our businesses and the law firms, so that if anything like this happens, like the outbreak of pandemic, we need to know how to adjust and maneuver through these challenging periods. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I think actually all of what you've said applies across the world with respect to what is being experienced by lawyers and law firms. Our next then group is group 4, which looked at trends. Herbert, can I ask you to come in here, please?
You have to unmute yourself, Herbert.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. I was saying that unfortunately we are not able to get it up on tour, so that means that I'm going to do it myself. And among other things that we discussed as for our in our group, we actually did discuss a couple of things related to responsible business trends, and one of the things that we discussed was related to environmental issues. And one of the things that was said by one of the group of discussants was that in terms of environment, Rwanda seems to have sort of staged up a couple of options or initiatives related to environment. And as a matter of fact, here we can give examples of, let's say, environmental impact assessments that have to be done, every time a project has to be undertaken. That was considered as one of the trends that have come up in Rwanda, whereby these things have been made more or less mandatory, especially for projects that are likely to affect the lives of people. Also, it was discussed that as a matter of trend, banks have started putting in place human rights policies, whereby at least these banks have come to appreciate the fact that these employees do not only need money, but they also need to be protected in one way or the other way. So as a result, human rights policies have been put in place by different organizations, particularly including some banks, as was cited by one of the group members. And then there was also another consideration of a trend related to moving from the analog system to digital system, whereby especially in this lockdown period of COVID-19, most of the employees have had to work from home as opposed to trekking to their offices or to their place of work. And this has largely, protected people's lives, especially from, contraction of COVID and so on. Also, as a trend, we have seen that Rwanda has actually put or positioned itself as one of those complying countries whereby they have had to report or to regularly report on the international commitments, both on international and national commitments that they have made. But of course, here we want to specifically also refer to like the reportings that have been done under these international treaties which Rwanda has committed to, including among others like the Convention on the Climatic Change. Of course, we've also touched base on things to do with the mining and construction, whereby these activities have been strictly regulated by the responsible country authorities to ensure that whatever they are doing is within the parameters of the rights of people, especially those ones that are being, especially those ones that are working with them. And here, of course, we are looking at the employment, whereby the people who have been working for these businesses have had to benefit from a number of registrations which provide, among others, like the minimum salary scale or the wage scale, but also the laws have been providing for time, as in which from what time that people can work from up to, and this has greatly improved the treatment or the welfare of employees that are working for these organizations. So overall, I think that is what the discussion touched based on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Herbert. And then to our final group, which looked at peer-to-peer learning. David, can I ask you or your group to speak to this? And also, David, can I say a big thank you for stepping in at short notice, since Hanningtone was unable to continue to join this session. So, David.
Thank you, Yasmin. In our group, we did discuss peer-to-peer learning. We happened to get a very good repertoire to present what the group discussed. Welcome, Pius.
Thank you, David. I think I can take it on. Hello, everyone. We discussed, we were basically sharing experiences from what we've worked on. And I think we had someone mention, we wanted to understand how organizations take care of human rights and take care of their employees, for example. And someone shared an experience of the tea estates in Kericho, that's in Kenya, how the company in charge of those tea plantations wasn't taking care of the employees. And this led to employees filing a petition at the UN. So we discussed that, looking at how corporates should be responsible and managing the human rights crisis that may occur. And in the same region, we saw that employees filed a suit against the company for lack of protection as a result of the election violences that occurred in Kenya, where one group, one tribe was targeted in those plantations. I think someone else who worked with a human rights organization shared something, because they assist refugees, and she said they are most vulnerable if they are not supported by the lawyers, then they have no one to run to. So she shared experiences of how they assist when they have legal issues. Yeah. The other point I think was these COVID times, how employees are harassed by their employers, cutting down salaries because they have no option. You'd rather stay and get a cut, or you go somewhere else, or you even go and don't get anything. So you'd rather get the little money that you can get. Another experience was someone who said, in terms of the expropriation for, let's say, if there are projects, if they're doing expropriation, they should consider not only expropriating people, but giving them money just, but where are they going next? Is it favorable? Do they have access to water and all the necessities, not just giving them money? And that's also partly a role of government. Yeah, briefly, I think that's what we talked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, everybody. Now I'd say that we are very much at the end of the webinar, and I hope that you found this informative. We'd really very much value your views on the session, and do hope that you will join us again in such future events. I now would like to say a very, very big thank you to our speakers for their insightful contributions, to Hanningtone, Julien, Roger, Anna, Herbert and Anthony, and also David. Thank you for sharing your experiences, knowledge and thoughts with us on what is, after all, becoming an increasingly important practice area. And I would like to thank you, our wonderful audience as well, for joining us today and for your contributions in the breakout groups. And I'd like to leave you with this final thought, that there is growing evidence that consumers are increasingly mindful of the sustainability credentials of companies and therefore are prepared to vote with their wallets. So remember, responsible business is good business and good business is profitable. So on that note, I now close the events. Thank you all.